I hate using the word groove because it sounds kinda dumb, but it's such an important concept to modern music, and I don't think it gets talked about enough considering how interesting of an idea it is. I mean, dancing is such a primal human activity, and music that makes you want to dance has this quality to it that just feels good on a visceral level. One of my top tier patrons, Packatax, requested that I take a look at the Knuckles Chaotix soundtrack, and after listening to a little of it, I thought it would be a perfect vehicle for discussing rhythm and groove in music, and what makes a tune rhythmically interesting. I think the basis for what makes rhythms interesting is a concept that I like to call rhythmic dissonance, where a note or beat is rhythmically placed somewhere we wouldn't expect, or somewhere that deliberately doesn't feel resolved, or somewhere that doesn't line up with other beats in a measure. A good example of this is the now ubiquitous idea of the backbeat. This is where beats 2 and 4 of a measure of 4/4 time, which are traditionally considered the weak beats, are heavily accented, usually by a snare drum or similarly loud and piercing instrument. This serves to contrast the strong beats of a measure, or beats 1 and 3, which are typically given to us by low instruments like the kick drum and the bass. Now, this probably doesn't sound especially groovy, and it definitely doesn't sound rhythmically dissonant on its own. But compare that to if we moved the snare drum notes so that they also accented the strong beats of the measure. Send someone to notify this beat's wife because it is dead. Now, after at least 70-ish years of constant use, the idea of the backbeat has become kind of the musical equivalent of flour. It's not very tasty on its own, but you definitely wouldn't want to run a kitchen without it. This beat is the most basic form of what we'd consider groovy in Western music. It inherently feels good, and it makes the music around it feel good too. But it's also the bare minimum of what you could call rhythmically dissonant, much like how the 5-to-1 progression in harmony is the most basic form of harmonic dissonance. So, how does the Knuckles Chaotix soundtrack use this idea to make groovy music? Let's start with the bass. This soundtrack has some super funky bass lines, and a lot of the time the bass will be the driving force behind what makes a groove work. I think this has something to do with having a good balance of downbeats and upbeats. Downbeats being the traditional 1, 2, 3, 4, and upbeats being the notes that occur in between these downbeats, like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and... Something I noticed about this game's soundtrack is that the bass will sometimes achieve a good balance between these downbeats and upbeats by borrowing from a rhythm called the partido alto. This rhythm is commonly used in samba music and consists of 4 downbeats offset by 3 upbeats. The cool thing about this rhythm is that it can be shifted around to start anywhere in a measure and it'll still work just as well. A perfect example of this can be found in the track Door into Summer. This bass part takes the partido alto rhythm, condenses it from 2 bars of quarter and eighth notes into 1 bar of 8th and 16th notes, shifts it ahead 1 beat from its typical form, and removes one of the upbeat notes to avoid being too busy. Even just this bass part by itself is rhythmically interesting. But when you add in the drum part, which gives us a straight backbeat to contrast this bass rhythm, things start to get really groovy. Another example of this well-balanced bass line can be seen in Midnight Greenhouse, where we see a cool variation of the partido alto rhythm. Here, the original pattern is shifted over 3 beats to start with the upbeat half of the rhythm rather than starting on a downbeat. This way, the bass dances around beat 1 of each measure without actually playing it. As I mentioned before, the strong beats in a measure are usually held down by the bass and kick drum, which sort of ground the music. But completely avoiding the most stable beat in the measure, the way we see here, is a perfect example of rhythmic dissonance, which creates musical interest. Another common type of rhythmic dissonance found in this soundtrack is the use of this dotted eighth note rhythm in the harmonic accompaniment. For an example, let's take a look at the track Speed of Sound. This rhythm mimics a 4/3 polyrhythm by splitting 3 beats into 4 equal parts, which works out to being the same as 4 dotted eighth notes over 3 quarter notes. It's not really a polyrhythm because it resets itself every bar by way of these two undotted eighth notes, so that each measure the pattern starts again from beat 1. This is a super common rhythm used in modern dance and pop music, and while it may even be considered overused at this point, it definitely contains some inherent rhythmic interest. This is just the most basic version of this rhythmic idea, however. Where this sort of thing gets really interesting is where you start letting it cross over the bar line. Take a look at Hyper Hyper. The main rhythmic idea in the accompaniment here is a shortened version of the same dotted eighth rhythm I showed you before. Where it gets more interesting is with this E-flat F-G walk-up. We see the first beat of this G measure preceded by two dotted eighth notes, which combined give us a continuous dotted eighth note pattern that's 4 beats long, only it runs from beat 3 of one measure to beat 3 of the next measure rather than being all contained in one 4-beat bar. This is what I mean by crossing the bar line. Another good example happens in the next couple bars where this short rhythmic pattern we're used to extends itself out of its own measure by a few beats. Again, we get a nice 4-beat long rhythm that, instead of fitting nicely inside of one bar, sits on top of 2 bars to create this cross rhythm. This sort of phrasing is another type of rhythmic dissonance, and it really causes the music to open up so things don't get too rigid. You can do a lot with this dotted eighth note rhythmic idea just by shifting it around to start in different places within a measure. Take a look at this Horizon, which actually uses the same 4-beat long dotted eighth note pattern we looked at before, only this time it stays safely contained within one measure. Again, what makes these types of rhythms really work is their relationship to the underlying beat. If you just listen to this type of rhythm in isolation, it doesn't necessarily feel all that groovy. But once you add the drums, which super clearly lay out the underlying beat with this simple kick-snare pattern, the rhythm really starts to groove. It's this relationship between two disparate rhythmic layers that propels the music forward. Going back to the tune Door into Summer, you can see how the exact same rhythm in the accompaniment that we saw in this Horizon interacts with the partito alto style bass line. The two rhythms interlock in a really interesting way, weaving around each other to make this rhythmic web that's just interesting to listen to all on its own. Add in some colorful harmony and a classic backbeat to ground the whole thing and you've got yourself a groove. This is a lot more advanced than the simple backbeat concept I mentioned at the start of the video, but it's really just an extension of the same idea. By putting 2 or more rhythmic layers at odds with each other, it creates this musical friction that's inherently interesting to listen to. And if done well, with a mind towards creating satisfying tension and release, it can even make a listener feel good on that visceral level. This is the whole idea of groove in a nutshell. Thanks so much to Pack Attacks for the suggestion, and thanks to all of you for checking out the video. If you have any questions or comments, concerns, jokes, platitudes, insults, or general life advice, you can find me on Twitter at 8BitMusicTheory. If you want to support the channel, you can check out my Patreon page here. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time.